This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 2 topic of approaches with a specific focus on the psychodynamic approach. So to begin, let's have a look at the specification and making sure we understand where the psychodynamic approach fits into the bigger picture and all of the core elements that you are expected to know about the psychodynamic approach. Starting with the role of the unconscious, the structure of personality, which is id, ego and superego, defense mechanisms, and you have to know repression, denial and displacement, and then psychosexual stages. So let's get started looking at the main assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. And the psychodynamic approach is really quite one that's rare in terms of all the other approaches that you've examined, because they believe that behaviour is a result of unconscious forces. We are exposed to things that we might actually forget, but they do continue to influence us. So this is known as psychic determinism, this idea that the unconscious mind shapes our behaviour with or without our awareness sometimes. They also believe that early childhood can have lasting effects into adulthood and behaviour, and that all behaviour can be explained through the inner conflicts of the mind and the inner conflicts of our personality, which is id, ego and superego. So here you have a definition of psychic determinism, which is that unconscious forces are innate, so they're natural, and they determine our behaviour. So everything we say and do has a cause, and that cause is anything that's unconscious to us. So we'll move on now to examine the role of the unconscious and some of those elements of psychic determinism. So if we start with the iceberg analogy, and this is a common analogy in the psychodynamic approach, just like the computer metaphor is used in the cognitive approach, this iceberg analogy is used for the psychodynamic approach. And that is because Freud argued that the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. The conscious mind only shapes our behaviour just a little bit. Most of our mind is made up of the unconscious, which is where we store our biological drives and instincts, and they affect our behaviour and personality in our day-to-day lives. The unconscious mind has threatening and disturbing memories that we repress, that we lock away, we bury deep down in that surface there. And that's because most of the contents are unacceptable. So they might be linked to sexual urges or traumatic feelings and memories that we hold maybe from childhood. Freud believed that there could be access through dreams or through slips of the tongue, Freudian slips or parapraxis. So you might relate if you've ever put your hand up in a lesson and called a female teacher mom instead of miss. That is a paraprax, that is suggestion that you deep down have some sort of unconscious thought of your mother and a connection to your teacher, something along those lines. And so bubbling under the surface of our conscious mind is the preconscious, which is just before you get to the deep, deep unconscious. And that contains thoughts and memories that we're not consciously aware of, but if we thought or we slept, we can access those. So dream state, daydreaming, etc. So that's the role of the unconscious, and the best way to articulate that is through your slips of the tongue example. Moving on now to Freud's theory of personality, which is that it is made up of the id, the ego and the superego. So in red you can see I've highlighted the sort of references that you want to be making when talking about the id, ego or superego. The id is our pleasure principle. It's the primitive, instinctive part of our an unconscious part of our personality that demands constant satisfaction. It wants it and it wants it right away. So it's a bit like it is your inner child, it's me, or it's the devil on your shoulder, it's telling you to eat that chocolate right now, even though it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. The ego is the conscious and intellectual part. It's the reality principle. So it regulates the id. It sort of calms the id down, but also calms the superego down, because the id and superego are massive sort of competitors, if you like. So you can see the ego as a bit of a referee. It balances the conflicts between the id and the superego. And then finally, the superego is your ethical and moral component. It's the moral principle. It's the goody two shoes, the angel on your shoulder, telling you that you shouldn't eat the chocolate now and you shouldn't eat the chocolate ever because chocolate is full of sugar and it's bad for you. It's one extreme to the other. And so the ego is like the mediator, the balance between, yeah, I'll have the chocolate, I won't have it right now, but I'll have it after my lunch or after my breakfast if I'm really craving it. But I'm going to make sure I get the right nutrients before I enjoy the chocolate. So the theory of personality from Freud claims abnormality occurs when a person has a weak ego and it cannot manage or mediate between the id and the superego effectively enough. So here's a little image that just shows you the an example of your id, ego and superego. So the ego, reality principle, the cat in the middle, the will to improve myself, the superego, that cat there, but then battling with the will to destroy myself, which is the ginger cat on the right. So moving on to defense mechanisms. The constant disagreements between the id and the ego and the superego can lead to a lot of anxiety. And so when articulating the need for defense mechanisms, it's really important you understand it's the role of the ego to defend itself. The constant battle between the id and the superego means the ego has to find some sort of way to protect itself. And so defense mechanisms step in, which we do use on a daily basis, but it's important to recognise they are unconscious. We're not aware that we are using these defense mechanisms all of the time. And if we overuse them, they can lead to mental abnormalities, such as psychosis, questioning your reality, schizophrenia, which is a break from reality, and that sort of thing. So the three defense mechanisms you have to know are denial, displacement and repression. They are all in the specification, so you could be given a direct question on one of those. So we're going to take a look at some silly examples. Remember, please, that defense mechanisms are unconscious, but these examples will help you understand what the defense mechanisms are, starting with covering your ears and refusing to accept reality. My husband would never cheat on me, even though her husband possibly did. So denial is when you completely reject the thought or feeling and refuse to acknowledge some aspect of reality. Now remember that this isn't always conscious, it's often unconscious. The next defense mechanism, exams. What exams? I have a party I need to find an outfit for. And this is to represent repression, where you force a distressing memory of exams out of your conscious mind and you sort of preoccupy yourself with other things. And then finally, taking it out on a pillow, punching a pillow because your parents won't let you out on the weekend. That is displacement, and that is where you transfer feelings of your true sources onto an emotion or a substitute target. So another example might be storming off and slamming the door, taking out your anger and aggression on something else and transferring those feelings, those true sources of your emotion onto something else. So those are your 3 defense mechanisms. And then moving on now to psychosexual stages, which is quite a chunky part of the psychodynamic approach. So you've got 5 different stages: oral, anal, phallic, latent and genital stage, all of which you need to know. And the best way to remember it is through this little statement: old age pensioners love Guinness, giving you the first letter of each of the stages. But let's have a look at what the stages actually involve. So the oral stage takes place between 0 to 1 years, and it's the id is only present. So the id is that devil on your shoulder, that immediate gratification through the mouth, which is why it's called oral, to represent the mouth. So that is when children will, put everything in their mouth, explore the world through their mouth, eat, cry, anything to do with that mouth area. Then the anal stage is from the ages of 1 to 3, and Freud does have a method to his madness here. It's the age of toilet training. So gratification, enjoyment, now moves from the mouth to the anus. So the releasing of the bowels. Eliminating that feces provides the child with pleasure, apparently, and it also brings them into conflict with their parents, because if they randomly eliminate, if there's sort of, soil their nappy randomly, then it can get parental disapproval. But if they don't use the toilet when they need it, then the id is not satisfied. That pleasure remains unsatisfied. Moving on to the phallic stage, which is the ages 3 to 5, and this is a really important stage here where children then take interest in their own bodies and other bodies, and boys go through the Oedipus complex. For girls, it's the Electra complex, but this is direct from Freud's theory, in which he does not consider girls because he is from the Victorian era, where women were oppressed in society. So the Oedipus complex is about that boy's feeling of desire for his mother and jealous and anger towards his father. That is the case study of Little Hans, which we'll examine shortly. Moving on to the latency stage, which is from the age of 6 up to puberty. So the drives that were responsible for gratification are now latent, they are dormant, they are inactive due to repression at the phallic stage and the Oedipus complex. So these repressed drives get redirected into other activities. So they start to have hobbies, they start to make friends, etc. And then finally the genital stage, which is from puberty onwards. So with puberty, there's then a re-emergence of earlier drives, those, sexual attraction drives, but this time not to their same-sex parent. Genitals have become the focus with adult expression of sexuality. They form loving relationships, which satisfies the drive of energy at this stage. So those are the psychosexual stages, which you need to be able to name, describe, and sort of refer to the ages. So then looking at how the psychosexual stages explain abnormal behaviour. Well, Freud believed that we're born as sexual beings, our libido, our sexual drive, and that sexual energy changes through those 5 stages. Each stage is marked by a different conflict which has to be resolved before you can move on to the next stage. Any psychosexual stage that is unresolved leads to the individual being fixated at that stage. So, for example, fixation in the anal stage can lead to an adult being very messy, which they call anal expulsive, or very tidy and neat freak, which is anal retentive. And so they carry out that behaviour and result that links to the stage they are fixated in. So if someone wasn't breastfed as a baby, they might grow up to have an oral fixation. They get fixated in that oral stage, and so they might develop Tourette's syndrome, or they might become a really heavy smoker. So being fixated in a stage leads to abnormal behaviour, according to Freud. Moving on to some research now into Freud's very bizarre ideas. There are some questions on the screen for you to have a think about. If you pause the video now, I'll go through the answers in 5 seconds. So a case study is an in-depth investigation into a single person, group or event. They are used in psychology to study rare cases or things that might not be practically possible to do as an experiment or completely unethical. And so that can be one reason that they're really useful. Their strength is that it allows you to study rare occasions which might have been otherwise unethical or just not possible. However, because it is only a single person, group or event, you lack that generalizability of the findings. So Freud has carried out a lot of case studies, very detailed investigations into the private lives of his patients to try and understand them, but also to help them overcome any issues. And so the case study you need to know about is that of Little Hans, which links to the phallic stage, the Oedipus complex of the psychosexual stages that we've just looked at. So Little Hans was a 5-year-old with a phobia of horses, and he refused to go out into the street in case he came across a horse. So clearly phobic of horses, and he was scared that the horse would bite him. However, Freud's analysis of Little Hans' experiences was this idea that his fear of horses was actually a defense mechanism employed by his ego, because the boy had gone through displacement, which is a defense mechanism where he has substituted the fear he felt for his father onto that horse, because he had an unconscious wish for his father to go away because he saw his father as a competitor for his mother's love. So Freud claims Little Hans was experiencing the Oedipus complex and displaced the feelings of animosity towards his father onto a horse, hence why he developed the phobia of horses. I will leave you to process that information and that case study. So you can think of how you can criticise this case study, but you can also consider how little Hans demonstrates Freud's ideas of the Oedipus complex. We will be evaluating this later on in the video. We move on now to treatment and this idea of psychoanalysis, which was founded by Sigmund Freud. And again, this is going to be really useful if you want to evaluate the psychodynamic approach, which is what we're going to do next. So Freud believed that people could be cured from depression, anxiety, and any psychological troubles by making their unconscious thoughts and motivations conscious. So it's really important techniques employed by Freud to help a person with these repressed traumatic childhood experiences. So there are different ones, projective tests such as the ink block tests like this image down here, which is this idea that how you interpret it will reveal what's in your unconscious mind, and the therapist can interpret your interpretation just by you recognizing maybe that you see this image as a butterfly or a mask. And then dream analysis, which is a really big one. As we've mentioned previously in this video, you can unravel your unconscious mind, make it conscious by exploring your dreams and what your dreams actually mean. Psychoanalysis is quite a lengthy process. It does involve lots of sessions, but it is about delving deep into that unconscious mind. And Freud did suggest a lot of different techniques that this could be done through. So bearing that in mind, let's think of some strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach, which will conclude the video. So this is your opportunity to pause the video, jot down some strengths and weaknesses before I go through them. So, strengths then. Freud was the first and the only approach to consider the role of the unconscious mind. As I said at the start of the video, Freud was very unique for that. Freud's theory, the psychodynamic approach, has helped us understand a wide range of behaviour, personality, abnormality, gender, lots of different areas, and it's successfully been applied to the real world. There are real life applications and it does help patients. Biscup et al. Reported a naturalistic study of 36 patients that demonstrated at the end of psychoanalytic therapy, 77% of patients showed significant improvements to their mental health. So clearly it's got some really useful real world applications, and that can link into this idea that no one else before Freud or even after sort of emphasised the need to explore the unconscious mind. However, there are some major weaknesses with Freud's theory. It's an unfalsifiable theory. This means it can't be proved right or wrong, which is massively unscientific, and it is an issue. We can't see the unconscious mind, we can't see the Oedipus complex to prove that it exists. And if you can't prove it exists, you can't prove it doesn't exist. So it's a bit of a pseudoscience, a fake science. It's just not useful in modern day psychology. His theories are also based on case studies, so Little Hans, and you can talk about the issues with case studies and also the fact that Little Hans' father was a good friend of Freud, so there's some elements of bias there in that Little Hans' father is writing to Freud, telling him the behaviour, possibly aware of Freud's theories and making sure that the Little Hans' behaviour sort of reflects those theories. The issue of psychic determinism, that it relies on the unconscious mind and that is everything that creates your behaviour. So it ignores the fact that we do have free will, or that we have biological things such as hormones and different parts of the brain that can cause and affect behaviour. And then finally, not least, Freud disregarding women, his theory suffering from gender bias because he didn't develop his views to consider women. So although I mentioned the electrical complex, that wasn't actually devised by Freud himself. That was by later psychologists trying to include women into the theory. So those are your strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach. Of course, you can probably think of an awful lot more, but if you go with each of those and develop those into peel paragraphs, there will be very effective evaluation points for the psychodynamic approach. So that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.